Hello, everyone. We've got a tight three-way race here in BC to talk about with our federal election pollster, Andrew Enns, who's the executive vice president with Leger. I'm Harold Munro, editor-in-chief of the Vancouver Sun in the province. Welcome again, Andrew.
Hi, Harold. Nice to be with you again.
Yeah. So, how is the race shaping up in BC based on this latest Leger polling?
Well, the race in British Columbia is showing signs of movement, and as pollsters, we love it when the numbers are moving. It gives us something to talk about. Earlier in the month, we did a poll, and I believe we shared some of that with the Sun, and we had a bit more of a two-way race at that time. We had the Liberals out front, 37% of decided voters, with the NDP in around 32%, and the Tories trailing at about 21%. But what we see in these latest polling numbers that we shared with you is we see the Liberals still out in front, 32% of decided voters. The NDP are at 29%, so close behind. But what's really interesting is the Tories have really made a move, and they're up to 29% as well. So as you noted, we have a three-way race.
Is that a statistical dead heat at this point, or
that really is, that really is, given the sample of 1,000. It's quite frankly, an interesting, very interesting race. Early days yet, a long way before E-Day, but definitely it's shaping up for an interesting one.
How do these voter preferences in BC differ, if at all, with the national numbers that you're seeing?
Well, nationally, we see a very close election nationally. Our Leger polling released earlier this week for the Post was 33% for the Liberals, 31% for the Tories nationally. The NDP were back around 20%. So not the three-way race, but a close race. But I think the other thing, most regions in the country, there's really either a two-way race between, more often than not, the Liberals and the Conservatives, or quite frankly, there's a dominant regional party, say Atlantic Canada, where the Liberals are very strong, or in Alberta, Saskatchewan, where the Conservatives are quite strong. So BC is actually fairly unique, and as we talked about earlier, it's going to make for maybe some late nights for our Eastern Canadian friends, as they have to stay up late and figure out what's going to happen out in British Columbia.
Well, that'll look good on them for this time around. Well, when you have a three-way race like this, how does that change the dynamics in the campaign? Because like you say, you can't necessarily target one opponent. Now you have to target two. So what should our viewers be watching for, just in how the leaders perform or the candidates perform?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that you'll see. First of all, as you said, they'll be looking for votes from each other, so they have to look at both parties, and you'll see that reflected in their policy announcements and how they position them and how they message them. They'll be trying to reach out, for voters on in both parties. In particular, I think you'll see, the Liberals looking at doing that a fair amount, because they tend to straddle the middle, and so they have an opportunity to take from either flank, and so I suspect you'll see more of that. I think the other thing that you'll see, Harold, and this is where BC politics gets even more curious, or as I like to say, regionally the province is not, it's chopped up, and when you start to parse out the province by region, you do see the race starts to shift a little bit, where maybe it's in some regions it might only be a two-way race, and you see that maybe in the interior or in northern British Columbia, with the Conservatives stronger there, and the NDP with pockets of support. But in that big vote-rich area of Greater Vancouver, the Liberals, that's much more of a three-way race, and you'll see lots of jousting back and forth there.
Yeah, it looked like the Liberals were a little stronger, though, in Metro Vancouver than they were relative to the Conservatives wide. And then, of course, the NDP very strong on the island.
Yes, for sure. And I think you can see that trend kind of continue. We'll look for that in some future polling. But certainly, when you get into Vancouver, like the metro part of Vancouver will really be the Liberals and the NDP vying, quite strongly for contesting some of those seats. Like I take a look at a seat like Vancouver Granville that's now come open with Ms. Raybolt not reoffering. That'll be a very hotly contested seat with I think all three parties have held that seat in the past, not that distant future.
That's interesting.
Certainly the Liberals and Conservatives.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I thought was interesting that Leger asked this time around is what people's second choice would be. So, for example, if you're a Liberal supporter, but you can't vote for a Liberal candidate this time, who gets your vote? So what did you learn from that question?
Well, what we see here, which is kind of interesting, the Liberals and the NDP, we could see some significant movement between those two parties potentially in this election. 6 in 10 current Liberal voters said that if they felt they might switch their vote, they were most likely to switch their vote to the NDP. And from the NDP voters' perspective, those saying they're currently voting NDP, a little over 4 in 10 of those voters said that they might switch and vote Liberal. So that's something right now, that's an interesting thing to have in the back of our mind. But as we get closer to voting day and we start to see momentum and we start to see that real hard push and that becomes a more important sort of dynamic. The Conservatives are a little less interesting in this front because a lot of Conservatives basically say, I don't really have a second choice. I'm all in with these guys, and if they don't work out for me, I may not vote.
But yeah, when it comes to the NDP, though, it seems like for Liberals and Greens, the NDP are the clear second choice.
Yep.
So
yeah,
you're getting into maybe some of those, like you say, if you get into the two party races, you might see some people, and anybody but Conservative vote, coalesce behind one or the other.
Well, and that's where we, and I think we talked about that earlier. That's where we got into potentially some of that strategic voting that as pollsters, it's important for us to be aware of these things because that's where we start to try to get a sense of where people are moving in those last days of the campaign, and we try to stay on top of that in terms of our research.
Great. So we'll watch for future polls to see if any of that sort of solidifies around one or more of the parties. So the Prime Minister was back in Metro Vancouver for a second time in a week, this time to promote the Liberals' housing affordability plan. Erin O'Toole's already been here and Jagmeet Singh's here in the first week. So BC appears to be important this time around, as you were saying, at least early on for the three parties. And housing appears to be an issue for all of them. So is that evident in the polling in any way, or?
Well, for sure, housing pops up as an important issue, and I always say, the numbers that you and I are looking at, Harold, the political parties have probably saw those numbers weeks or months ago, right. To some degree, right? I mean, they're doing their work, and this is important stuff for them, and so clearly, and as we talked about. I like to sort of look at housing maybe in a slightly broader picture as really sort of a pocketbook, living affordability question, and other things are coming into that. We saw some fairly significant inflation numbers come out, last week, and that will fuel the whole notion of, how do young families get going? How do they get started? How do they sustain themselves? And parties have tapped into that. And so, you've got three very clear and, from my vantage point, fairly different housing, strategies to address this housing affordability. And it'll be interesting because they're talking to people in parts of this country that there's a lot of electoral seats up for grabs. When I think of that greater Vancouver area, the greater Toronto area, cities like Calgary and London, this is an important issue, and if a party can tap into it, it could be pretty fruitful ground for them.
Good, that's good. One of the things a lot of people were asking going into the election is whether the fact that it was called during a pandemic, and here in BC the wildfire emergency, whether that would hurt anybody or impact people's voting decisions. Based on this latest poll from you guys, it doesn't appear to have a significant impact, which has got to be good news for the Liberals.
Yeah, well, for sure, certainly. I think and we may talk about the pandemic a bit more. I think the pandemic is still a bit of an open question because that's an evolving issue. And I think as even in your province, things are starting to change, not for the better. The wildfires, I was watching that one a little bit, Harold, and I'd agree. I mean, we asked the question whether or not it might change, affect their voting, and we only had 14% of British Columbians say that that would be a factor, which is relative to the other points a low score. I was watching it because I recall the 1997 election campaign, and Jean Chrétien called the election, about a year early. And he happened to time it when Manitoba's flood of the century was hitting, and our Red River was overflowing its banks, and a lot of people here in my province were really upset. And at the end of that election, the Liberals were down 6 seats. So I would say there's some Liberals who were probably breathing a little sigh of relief that the wildfire situation seems to have maybe, hasn't gotten worse, and it appears not to have injected itself into this campaign.
That's good. Yeah, on the pandemic, I mean, well, that could be good news for the Liberals. When it comes to how he's handling the pandemic, Trudeau may have a bit more of an issue. I mean, your latest tracking has Bonnie Henry support at 70%, Health Minister Adrian Dix 63%, so still very strong, very popular. Trudeau down at 48%. Is that a concern?
Well, I think it's something the Liberals definitely want to be aware of. The pandemic, as it's gone on, has been tough on elected politicians. We've seen that in our Leger tracking. We've been tracking regularly since the beginning back in March 2020, and so we've seen those satisfaction numbers decline for the governments and elected politicians. I think if anything, I mean, the pandemic is a moving target right now. This fourth wave is something that I think we're going to monitor, and we're going to start asking more questions about in terms of, is this going to inject itself in the campaign in terms of, do they affix any blame on politicians for having to maybe go back into more lockdown situations, wearing masks again when we didn't have to. So we want to understand that. I think, probably first and foremost, if I were Justin Trudeau, I'd want to make sure that whatever I'm saying on the pandemic, I'm on the same side as what Dr. Bonnie's saying on the pandemic.
Okay. We could all take that advice, I think.
Yeah.
All right, Andrew, thank you. Thanks for your time again today. Look forward to our next chat.
My pleasure, Harold, for sure. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.